I'm Frank Garza, and welcome to Here and Abroad, a podcast that follows the U.S. men's national team and their player pool across Europe, MLS, or wherever else they play their club football. On today's show, we're going to preview the Olympics for the U.S. men's team. The U.S. kicks off their first match against hosts France on Wednesday, July 24th. To help me preview the competition, I've invited Seth Vertelny to join the show. Seth is the managing editor at Pro Soccer Wire. Seth, welcome to the show.
Hey, Frank, thanks for having me.
So, as you know, for the Olympics, men's soccer, it's a U23 competition. Each team brings a roster of 18 players, 3 of which can be overage players, but, everyone else must meet the under 23 age requirement. So first question for you is, how good of a team do you think the U.S. was able to assemble considering the overall kind of U23 pool in the country?
Yeah, realistically, I think this is about as good a team as you could have reasonably expected. Of course, there are a lot of players who are age eligible for this tournament that have graduated to the senior team. Guys like Fuller and Balogun and Gio Reyna, Yunus Musa, Malik Tillman were never going to be part of this tournament after they also participated in the Copa America. So that wasn't really a realistic possibility. There are a few guys who have been part of this U23 group that weren't released. I think a couple of the names that stand out are Brian Reynolds, right back, Aiden Morris, who probably would have played a big role for this team, but just moved to Middlesbrough, so he's going to stay with that team and participate in their preseason. But aside from that, I think I was actually kind of pleasantly surprised by a few of the guys that were released, particularly the Venezia guys, Tanner Tessman and Gianluca Buzio. They're both big parts of that team, and they're in their preseason coming up as they make their return to Serie A. So I think that it was definitely good to see them released from the perspective of the U.S. team, as well as Kevin Paredes. He's been a pretty important player, starting some games, coming off the bench, and others for Wolfsburg. And so having him released is also a big boost for this team.
Yeah, I mean, you made an important note there that a lot of the maybe best U.S. U23 players have kind of already graduated to the senior team. I think that's important to note here that this isn't, I mean, think about it this way. If you were to just look at the entire U23 pool of American players, forget if they've gone to the senior team, forget if they got released by their club, and let's say you were going to name a best 11 of U23 players from the American pool, are any of those 11, do you think, on this team, except for maybe goalkeeper, maybe Patrick Schulte is the best U23 goalkeeper, I don't know, but is there anybody else that is on this team from a best 11, do you think?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think goalkeeper is definitely a good shout, and I'm sure there's some people who look at a guy like Patrick Schulte or Gabriel Salina or Chris Brady, who's not on this team, and say like maybe they should be given a chance with the senior team right now. But yeah, otherwise, this team is filled with guys that aren't really in the mix when it comes to the full national team. And when you look up and down this roster, best case scenario, maybe 2, 3, 4 of them can kind of break through and become regulars with the senior team in the future. I mean, most of them have been capped by the senior team, with the caveat that a lot of them, were January caps. But yeah, I mean, definitely the senior team has been kind of a young team for the last 2 or 3 years, kind of since the 22 World Cup when they were the second youngest team there. And yeah, a lot of those guys would be age eligible. And so, from a U.S. fan perspective, I think it's a positive that, some of the guys that I had mentioned aren't going to be part of this team. But certainly, if you were to put together the best roster of American men's players born after January 1st, 2001. A lot of these guys on the Olympic squad wouldn't make it if everybody was available.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. I think that is a positive way to look at it. Is it is kind of does show you when you look at the U.S. men's senior team, even though a lot of these guys we've been watching for the last 4 or 5 years have been there for a while, it is still a young team. I mean, it is still made up of a lot of U23 players. I'm seeing this roster of players we're sending to the Olympics as kind of guys that maybe are on the bubble, maybe future players that could break into the team. That's what I'm kind of excited to kind of watch for, is to see maybe who can stand out and kind of make a name for themselves. When you look at the roster, who are some of the players you're most excited to watch in the tournament?
Yeah, the first guy that jumps out is one that I mentioned as being kind of a pleasant surprise as being released, and that's Tanner Tessman. I think for fans that haven't seen him over the last couple of years, which I'm sure is most of them because he's been playing in the Italian second division, he's really upped his game to the point where he was one of, if not the best players in Serie B last year. He helped get Venezia promoted, but it doesn't seem like he's going to stay there, even though they did move up to the Italian top flight. There was a rumored move to Inter that just seemed to fall through, but there's a lot of interest in him. And, this will be a showcase for him. And I think he's a guy that I could see kind of breaking through into the senior team if he continues on this trajectory and he does get a move to a team somewhere and does well, or if he stays at Venezia and does well because they're going to be in Serie A again, and so he's a guy that I'm really looking forward to seeing. Some of the attacking players that are interesting to me are definitely another guy I mentioned, Kevin Paredes. He's a guy who's been with the senior team. He's still young, 21, and so I think he has the ability to kind of push on to the senior team if he can, keep going with Wolfsburg, have a good tournament. And another one that I think is, probably one of the more important players on this squad is Duncan McGuire, because he's the only true center forward that Marko Mitrovic brought to the Olympics. We remember he had a little bit of a transfer saga with Blackburn a few months ago where he was going to go through, or the transfer was going to go through, and there was a little snafu with paperwork and attaching PDF files, and long story short, it all fell through. But he's someone who's been pretty dominant in MLS in his first season and a half, and definitely can earn a move back to Europe with a good tournament here.
Yeah, I'm excited to watch. I'm excited to watch all of the forwards, the attacking players that they're bringing. I mean, when you look at the U.S. men's senior team, they have a hard time scoring goals, a lot of times. And so if you're a player that wants to kind of break through into the team, if you can go into a competition like the Olympics and score a bunch of goals, that's one way to kind of put your name into whoever the new coach is as somebody that maybe we need to bring in. And so, Paxton Aronson, Taylor Booth, Duncan McGuire, Kevin Paredes, Griffin Yao, these are all young Americans who are already playing in Europe, except for Duncan McGuire, like you said, who's should have already been there, is probably going to be there soon. And so I'm just really looking forward to see if one of these guys can step up and score some goals, for the U.S. What about the overage players? Walker Zimmerman, Miles Robinson, Jordy Mihalovic. Which of those three guys do you think are going to be most impactful for the team, or are you most excited to watch?
Yeah, I think bringing Walker Zimmerman and Miles Robinson as overage players really made a lot of sense for this team. The pool of center backs to choose from was not very deep. So when you look at a position where the experience and the partnership of guys like Zimmerman and Robinson could make an impact, it's definitely in defense. This was a duo that a couple years ago was the first choice starting center backs for the senior team, and then Robinson suffered his injury leading up to the World Cup, but they've played together before. They've got a lot of experience with the senior team, and I think that they're going to be really good additions to this team. The other one is Georgi Mihailovic, which is I think a little bit more of a controversial pick because he's been doing really well in MLS with Colorado this year, and so it's not really a slight on him, but his inclusion seemed to be at the expense of Diego Luna, who's been lights out in MLS this year. He is age eligible, and so if you included him instead of Mihailovic, that would have opened up another overage spot at a position where maybe the U.S. needed it more. And of course, Diego Luna is a dual national, and anytime he isn't selected for an American team for a big competition, at least in theory, that would push him a little bit closer to picking Mexico. And I think if he does pick Mexico, that would be a big blow for U.S. soccer because he's extremely good and still only 20.
Yeah, he's good and he's exciting. I mean, he's the type of player that fans get excited to watch. When he's on the field, when he gets on the ball, you can't help but sit up a little straighter in your seat and kind of like be excited about what he might do. I think the Miles Robinson is a good shout. I'm really interested to see what he can do because he's a guy that it wasn't that long ago, even after he came back from his injury, that he was starting for the U.S. men's senior team, and it seems as of late he's been kind of slipping, farther and farther down the depth chart. I don't think he played 1 minute, at the Copa America, and so this seems like an important tournament for him to showcase himself. And if he doesn't, if he has a negative performance, I think that could really spell some bad news for him in terms of his senior team outlook. What about the coach?
Sure.
No, sorry. Go ahead, Seth.
I was just going to say, yeah, for sure. Just the U.S. center back pool is very fluid right now. So I think you're right. If he has a good performance here, he can get right back into it.
Yeah. And that's one thing maybe I know that was a position in need for this Olympic team as center backs, but it's also kind of disappointing because, I think Chris Richards is really kind of standing out as one of the center backs of the future, but it seems to be pretty wide open for who that next spot is. And I would have loved to seen some young guys on this Olympics team kind of fighting for it, but doesn't look like that's going to happen. Well, definitely isn't going to happen. So my next question is about the coach, Marko Mitrovic. He was appointed by Greg Berhalter, to take on this manager of the Olympic team. So, I mean, should we expect him just to play mostly Berhalter ball, or what can you tell us about him and the style of play that he likes to employ?
Yeah, this is kind of the first real big chance for Mitrovic, at least as a head coach with the U.S. He's been a head coach with Serbia and their youth program, but I think that he is someone who's going to be pragmatic. I think he's going to tailor the U.S.'s style based on who they're playing against. Their first game is going to be against France, maybe the most talented team in the tournament, the host nation, one of the favorites. So I would expect the U.S. to go a little bit more defensive there. And then when they have their next two games against New Zealand and Guinea, I think they might set up a little bit more attacking. But Mitrovic, he's kind of an unknown as a head coach. He's got a pretty good resume as an assistant in MLS, in England, in the youth ranks with the U.S. and with Serbia. So I think for him, this is a big moment in his coaching career, and it'll be interesting to see, like you said, if he does kind of stick to a similar way that that the senior team has played over the last few years under Greg Berhalter, or if he tries something different.
Yeah. You mentioned that first match against France, coming up, and let's talk a little bit about the U.S. Their group. I guess first of all, take a step back. This Olympic competition, there's 16 teams, 4 groups. The top 2 from each group advance to the quarterfinals, knockout round. So the U.S. is in Group A with France, Guinea, and New Zealand. What do you think their chances are of advancing out of that group into the knockout round?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I think that the 3 teams other than France are going to be eyeing second place. It's going to be one of those situations where if the U.S. gets a result against France, then that's a huge bonus. But if not, they can still feel reasonably good about their chances of advancing, assuming that France can also beat Guinea and New Zealand. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on Guinea and New Zealand's under 23 team. I think there are some experienced players on those rosters. You look at Guinea; they have a guy, Naby Keita, former Liverpool player, is there as an overage player. New Zealand, they have Michael Boxall, captain of Minnesota United. But when you look up and down those 2 rosters, and then you look at the U.S. squad, I think that the U.S. can consider itself to be the favorites against those teams, and therefore, I think that getting out of this group is a realistic expectation for the U.S. And when you do get out of that group, anything can happen because you're already in the quarterfinals. You're 1 win away from playing for a medal. But yeah, Olympic men's soccer is unpredictable because, as we know, these are not the senior teams. You've got kind of these global powers like Argentina and France and Spain in this tournament, and then they're mixed in against some teams that you don't normally see at big international tournaments, and so there's always the potential for upsets. And I think the U.S. can feel pretty optimistic about their chances of at least getting through this group, and from there, who knows what they could do.
Yeah, they did play. The U.S. has played recent matches against 2 of these teams. They played both France and Guinea in March in friendlies, and they drew 2-2 against France. They beat Guinea 3-0. But like you said, it's hard to predict the performance of these U23 teams when you don't really know maybe much about their U23 pool. But I would say that if the U.S. doesn't get out of the group, just looking at the teams and looking at how they're known for like just being like as footballing like nations, and what their senior teams can do. If the U.S. doesn't get out, I think it's going to be a huge disappointment, whether that's justified, or not. I think people will be disappointed. So yeah, hopefully they can do what they need to against, Guinea and New Zealand, and get out. If they do make it out, their quarterfinal matchup would be against Group B. Either whoever finishes first or second in Group B, depending on where the U.S. finishes, and that's Argentina, Morocco, Iraq, and Ukraine. You got to figure that's probably going to be Argentina and then one of those other 3 teams. We both kind of sound like it's most likely if the U.S. gets out, they'll get second, which means it's probably most probable that they play Argentina in that quarterfinal. I mean, what's your expectations then? I mean, it is I guess what I kind of want to know is not just that quarterfinal, but like what does a good performance look like to you for this like U.S. team? Do they have to get a win against a team like Argentina, or just make it out of the knockout rounds? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to define exactly what a good performance is. It kind of depends, how the group stage goes, and whether the U.S. is on the front foot, whether they're playing well against New Zealand and Guinea, whether they're able to kind of impose themselves, and you can always judge tournaments, based on results. And at this level, you probably should. But I also think that it is still a youth tournament, and so player development is a goal. So like, let's say the U.S. doesn't get out of the group, but they have a few really strong individual performances, and maybe a player or two earns a transfer to a big club. I mean, that might help the program in the long run more than if they kind of grind out a few results, get to the quarterfinals, and lose to Argentina. But like I said, I think when you look at this group, the U.S. should have the expectation of getting through, and if everything plays out like we expect it to, and given it's the Olympics, we don't really have the ability to say for certain how things are going to play out. But if they do end up with that game against Argentina in the quarterfinal, they'll certainly be the underdog. This Argentina team does have some really strong young players. They also have overage players that are kind of fixtures with the senior team, like Julian Alvarez and Nicolas Otamendi. So yeah, I think anything beyond a quarterfinal appearance will probably be a bonus for this team. But I think if they get out of the knockout stage, or if they get out of the group stage into the knockouts, that would probably be a job well done, just in terms of a team performance perspective.
Yeah, that's a good point though about the individual performances as well. Now that you've said that, I think for me, I'd be pretty satisfied if they made it out of the group into the knockout rounds, and if there was a couple of individual performances that were really great, maybe performance good enough to earn a good transfer, like you mentioned, or a serious call up into the next senior team camp, which is going to be coming up for a couple of friendlies here in September. That would be, I'd feel pretty good about that. I'd feel actually really good about that. Well, Seth, thanks again for joining the show. I'll make sure and put links in the show notes to your X account, which is at @svertelny, and also to your work at Pro Soccer Wire. But before I let you go, any final thoughts you'd like to share?
I'm looking forward to seeing the U.S. back. I think, we were talking a little bit before we started recording about how excited we are for this particular tournament. And I think it might be a slow build, but to have the U.S. men and women playing at the Olympics together for the first time in 16 years, I think is exciting. And, hopefully both teams get through the groups and can kind of draw in some of the more casual fans that are tuning into the Olympics and maybe aren't necessarily huge soccer people, but they want to watch the Olympics. And I think if that happens, it'll be a big success for American soccer.
Yeah. There's going to be a lot of soccer to watch again after we had a lot of soccer with the Euros and the Copa America. Now we're kind of on a break, and I'm glad that there's going to be a lot of good soccer on TV with both the men and the women playing. Thanks again, Seth, and thanks to everyone for listening to Here and Abroad. If you enjoyed the episode, please do me a huge favor and hit that subscribe button if you're watching on YouTube, or that follow button if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or somewhere else. Thank you so much. I'm Frank Garza. You can follow me on X at FrankGarza007, and I'll be back next week with a new episode.